Today I'm in a black and white mood for doing a spread in my art journal. No idea why, maybe because I'm wearing a black and white skirt. I'm thinking of doing a black and white spread with a pop of colour. Sometimes I start doing an art journal with an idea in mind, a phrase in my head, or a thought. This is all going to be all about the colour. So I've picked out a few pieces of black and white paper. I found the entry from an old dictionary, the black page. I've got some origami paper that's black and white or grey and white, double-sided, so that's nice. I've got a bit of old sheet music. I've got some grey packaging paper, and I think that's more than enough. You can go a bit over the top with collage, and I am going to start with collage. Often I think, oh, well, I'll start with some writing. I might write about what I think black means to me or black and white means to me. I might write about, I don't know, thinking about black and white in terms of race, black and white in terms of being overly sure of everything, seeing, not listening to other people's opinions, seeing everything as black and white. I could do that sort of thing. But today I'm just wanting to really sort of get a move on. I don't know, I feel an urgency today. So I am just going to jump in. But in my head, I'm thinking of those things. When I do collage, I try and vary the sizes of the pieces of paper, as well as the types of paper I use. I try and vary the thicknesses, the transparencies, and just make it as interesting as possible. Try and work in as intuitive a way as possible as well. Much prefer a torn edge rather than a cut edge, as you can see I'm tearing here, and I'm positioning things on the page just to get an interesting composition. Oh, I'm not sure I want bladder written there. It's the trouble with using text. You do actually have to look at what you're doing. If I put that under there, we could have the black showing here. Okay, I think that would work. Don't worry about bits going outside the page at the moment. We can rip those off. I'll keep the spare bits to one side just in case I change my mind later on. I use matte gel medium to stick my papers down. You could use PVA glue, that's white school glue. You could use Mod Podge, stuff like that. I like this because it is archival and it's pretty reasonable and very multi-use, because you can use it to seal your papers afterwards, and it gives a bit of tooth as well because it's matte. So that's what I choose to use. Use a brush that doesn't matter, certainly not your nice watercolour brushes. Now, it's probably a wise idea to take a photo at this point, especially if you've done quite a complicated layout. Always a good idea to put the glue onto the heaviest paper. In this case, that's the actual journal. And then you can stick it down. If you're concerned about the medium going on to previous sheets, just put an old piece of paper under there and it'll protect your previous work. Now, this packaging material is quite thin, so I'm putting the medium on top like that. Pay lots of attention to edges because they tend to dry up and lift, which we obviously don't want. Don't worry if you get extra medium on top. That's probably a good thing because it will help seal in the paper. And while we do want texture, we don't want massive wrinkles because it'll make it hard to work on top of this with any paint later on. So aim to a certain extent to try and get it fairly smooth. So I've stuck down the left-hand side. I'm just going to protect my other pages by popping an old bit of paper underneath. I'm moving those to one side. And when you start collaging, it's really hard to cover up papers. So I'm covering up some of that dictionary, and that sort of feels like it's going against the grain. But what you have to realise, it's still there and it will glint through your work, and psychologically you know it's still there. So you kind of have to get over covering up your work. When we're working with mixed media like this, we're working in layers, and the layers add layers of meaning. So each layer contributes to the final effect. You're not getting rid of things, you're not undoing the work that you've already done or covering up something beautiful. You are, everything is playing its part, I think is the nicest way of thinking about it. The other thing people sometimes get worried about is tearing up books. So like I'm tearing up this old dictionary, and they say, well, you should just donate them to charity, or to, if it's a children's book, to a child should be reading that, you shouldn't be ripping it up. And absolutely, I was brought up not to damage books. With everything stuck in place, we can either let it dry, or we could use some gesso over the top, which will unify the page and prepare it for a bit of painting. So that's what I like to do. So gesso will seal the papers, especially if they're quite absorbent like this packing material, or if they're a little bit shiny, it'll give them some tooth. So it seals the papers, it protects them, and it gives a little bit of grip. You can get white gesso or clear gesso. Clear gesso is obviously great if you want text to show through, whereas white is great if you want to disguise something. So I'm going to put the gesso on now before that glue's dry, simply so it can all dry together, and then I can come back and hopefully do some more. If you've used some quite fragile papers, none of these are particularly fragile, well, the packing paper is a little, but say you'd use tissue paper or a napkin or something, do go careful as you put this over the top, because they do, when they're damp, they are fragile and they may rip even under the sort of weight of a brush. I'm not going to use any white gesso here at all, because I have in my mind that I'm going to put those pops of colour that I talked about sort of here, and it's quite plain. But say I decided I wanted to put the pops of colour here and I was using something quite transparent, I might want to put some white gesso just to calm down that music. If it's all you've got, then use it, because white gesso isn't fully opaque. A thin coat will still be slightly transparent, and it can be a good way of blending in edges if you've got some obtrusive edges, if you've used a really thick paper or something. This layer needs to fully dry, and you do need to wash that brush out. Our pages are just about dry at the moment, so we can take out our protective sheets. Keep those for another time, and we can remove the excess. Best thing to do is to turn it over so you can see from the back and just rip it off, which for me is in keeping with the deckled edge of my journal. If you prefer a cut edge, obviously you can cut it, or you might actually like leaving the overlaps and having those rough edges, but I personally prefer to tear them off. And there's the collage background with neater edges. Usually at this point I'd be adding colour, but the whole point of this is that it's black and white, it's pretty monochrome. So what I want to do next is add some texture, and I've picked out some possible stencils, including a brand new one. That's what I think I might use. I just like that with all the scientific sort of data. And I quite liked the fact that I had dictionaries, so I've got words, I've got music, and I thought I would get some maths on there. And I'm saying not everything is black and white, or in my head I'm thinking not everything's black and white, but we have art and we have science in the mix. That's kind of where my head's going, so I'm thinking I might add some of that. I've got modelling paste. This is from Pabio, and it's made with recycled bottle and binder. Let me show you how I like to apply it. We actually apply modelling paste through the stencil and it looks so good. Use a palette knife and just gently press it through the bits on the stencil that you want to come out. When you're happy, pull it off and you get raised patterns. I'm going to just do the same in another place. Won't show up as well over here because it's on a white background. You'll need to wipe your stencil afterwards to make sure none of that modelling paste is left on there. While that's drying, we can think about our lettering, and I want to say not everything is black and white, and I could print that out on my computer and play around with the fonts. That would be, and then collage it. That would be one way of doing it. I could handwrite it. That could be another way. But today, because I'm trying to keep everything black and white, what I thought I'd do is actually use printing blocks and then print on some tissue paper, which I'll then stick on. That will help the lettering really show through, but also help me with the placement. So I've got a little set of printing blocks, which weren't very expensive, and I've got an ink pad. Do check what sort of ink it is. This is pigment ink, which means that once it's dry, it will be waterproof. Not all ink is. So the advantage of the tissue paper is that you can print it out onto here, actually get it right, and then apply it to your journal. So say I looked at that and I'm not happy with the splodge of ink, I can just do it again. Same splodge of ink, it's obviously the thing. But it just gives you a bit more flexibility. So you've printed them out and you can choose the one that you are happiest with. So again, while that's drying, we could do a little bit more stamping. We're going to have stamped wording, but we could use a little bit more stamping. And I've got these. So I've got some script, which I rather like. And I've got some bugs. Now, you might not have stamps, but you might have some paper with handwriting on that you could collage in if you want. You might just write if you want I think I am going to stamp because I've got it. But you need to just improvise and use what you've got. I'm not going to put it on a block because I want some of this to go off the edge of the page. I want to get our writing on. You can now see the big advantage of printing it out because I can play around with it. I could say that's the arrangement I like. I don't. You could use a glue stick or you can just go back to your gel medium. I think I want to add more black to this. So I'm found another stencil and I've got a little bit of black gouache. You could use your ink, you could use acrylic, and I am going to do some vertical stencils here. So I've got an old brush and I'm just gently tapping through the stencil in the area I want it to go. Big thing with stencils is that the paint isn't too runny so that it doesn't seep under if you want a crisp edge. Just check how that's looking, and I quite like that. And I'm going to just stencil a couple of little black circles too. I think this is getting quite busy and I think the black circles will act as quite a nice like an exclamation mark. And now it's time for my visual joke, which is a few splashes of colour, and I have also got some gouache here which is saffron green, really quite lurid, and some rather gorgeous, well, it's called rose, but it's like a really bright pink. Oh, I think I should be brave and do a big circle. And the reason I like doing this with gouache is that it's quite thick, but it is very opaque and dries to a matte finish. So it's a bit different than if you used acrylic. Acrylic tends to have a bit more of a shiny finish. If that's what you've got, that's what you've got. You can make any minor adjustments that you want, but as always, stopping too soon rather than too late, a good idea. Because we could come back to this in a year's time and decide to do something different and add something to it. But it's always a little trickier to take off than it is to add. So the modelling paste is dry, and just using an ordinary HB pencil, I would like to make it look a bit more 3D. It wasn't the crispest modelling paste I've ever done in my life, but if I put a little bit of shadow like this, so it definitely just makes it look a little bit more 3D. I don't need to go round it all, but just as a point of emphasis. Don't you think that makes a difference? So we shouldn't, when we're doing all this mixed media, and you see people on YouTube and they've got, they've got Posca pens and stamps and stencils and this and that, and you think, oh yeah, it was fine for you, you've got all that stuff. But don't overlook the tools you've got and just try and improvise as much as possible. Use what you've got rather than rushing out and buying new stuff. And then you'll see where the gaps are in your sort of stash of different materials, and you can sort of supplement from there. But good old pencil or a biro, bit of watercolour, few things like that is all you need. Obviously, it's loads of fun when you've got all these different media to try out, but you don't need it, and you don't need to put off doing it simply because you haven't got all the latest materials. And I'm going to call that a day. There's my spread. It's actually a pretty simple one. We used only a few different papers, a bit of music, a bit of packing paper, a bit out of an old dictionary. I think that was all we used in the background. We didn't do any painting of that colour because it was meant to be black and white. We did create a little bit of texture. We did a little bit of stenciling. We used some stamps to add some of this text and to prepare the words, which let us sort of try it out, and then just used a spot of gouache to add the little visual joke at the end.